From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions. Joining me today, as our viewers can see, is my regular co-host, Jack Hinrichs. And,
Howdy, y'all.
and today, I'm going to give Jack the hosting duties. I'm going to try to take my hands off the steering wheel, allow Jack to take over. Because what we're going to talk about today is what I guess we can call the several crises in Canada, political crises in Canada right now. Now, there's a story, it's almost certainly apocryphal, where there was a big conference of American journalists, and they were tasked with coming up with like the most boring newsworthy headline possible. And the winner was Crisis in Canada.
That's good. That's good.
So we're gonna run with that, something like that.
Mhm,
Maybe we're gonna have to restructure that a little bit clearly, but
mhm.
in the spirit of that, this might turn out to be the least engaging newsworthy discussion we ever have
Yeah.
in Canadian news. This is, and
Mhm.
we're recording on Friday at noon Mountain Time. Um, a great Canadian actress just died. We got news about an hour ago that a great Canadian actress, Catherine O'Hara,
Mhm.
died at age 71. For those who've watched Home Alone, she was the mom in Home Alone. She did Second City. Probably her best work was with Christopher Guest doing the mockumentaries alongside, Eugene Levy. Um, and most recently, she had fame in Schitt's Creek, which I know was a big
Yeah.
Canadian show, but then it was picked up around the US as well.
One of
So
my mom's favorite shows. My mom's in mourning at the moment.
fair enough. Well, I understand. I mean, Catherine O'Hara she was a gem. Love Catherine O'Hara.
Yeah.
Okay, Jack, on that somber news, I'm going to kick it over to you. And,
Okay.
it's going to be interesting. We're going to let an American interrogate me about Canadian politics. We'll see how it's going. But actually, I should, you know, do a couple of quick disclaimers. First of all, I am Canadian. I spent a lot of time in Canadian politics, observing Canadian politics, participating in Canadian politics. But I've also lived in the United States now for almost 7 years. What that means is that although I still sort of think of myself as an insider, I'm not an insider anymore. I'm also in the United States, which, given the current climate, is sensitive. And I'm speaking primarily to an American audience, which means that the moment is a little bit sensitive. Because of that, I'm not going to try to advocate for anything. I'm just going to do my best to provide analysis. I do have personal opinions on some of these things, but I am going to do my best to shelve them.
Yes, absolutely. Mhm. All right. Well, this is terrifying to take over the reins of the Politics in the Past to Desert Dialogues podcast. I suppose we should start. I know that you alluded to your history in Canada and your work specifically in Canadian politics. I was wondering, before we get into the present crises in Canada, if you could tell the viewers and the listeners a little bit more about what you've done in Canadian politics, just so they can get a more thorough sense of your position analyzing the issue.
Sure. So I volunteered on a lot of campaigns, a lot of constituency association stuff primarily.
Mhm.
Some
Sure.
policy committee work at, that kind of thing. Nothing serious. I was a campaign manager once, for a campaign. But I mean, so I have that experience working in politics. That was over the course of about 12 to 15 years. Um, but I have been a close observer. I mean, my first degree in political science was in Canadian political science.
Absolutely.
So participant, hopefully intellectual observer, um, maybe wouldn't go as far as to say expert, but pretty knowledgeable anyway.
Absolutely. And, you know, you are perhaps not an expert academically in Canadian politics, but in the United States, there's often a great deal of ignorance about the particulars of Canadian politics. It's common for many Americans to sort of view Canada as a unified entity, when in fact there are very distinct differences between the different provinces and the different regions of Canada. So, one of the places that we're going to talk at length about today is Alberta. And I was wondering if you could give us your Canadian account of Alberta specifically, how it differs from the rest of Canada, its unique facets. What does it mean to be Albertan?
That's a great question. And first of all, I love how you phrased it. What does it mean to be Albertan? One of the most interesting things in Canada is that depending on which province you're in,
Mhm.
either you identify more with your province or you identify more with the country. So, which identity is more important to you? Being Canadian or being an Albertan or being a British Columbian or being an Ontarian?
Mhm.
This data goes back a long time. So, I'm talking 20 years ago, not 2025 here, but 20 years ago when they tracked, the last time I looked at this data and it was being tracked, every province other than Prince Edward Island and Ontario viewed themselves, their identity was more shaped by what province they were from rather than being from Canada. And in the case of Alberta, that's stronger than most.
Okay.
So being Albertan to most Albertans is more important than being Canadian.
Sure.
So that's, I think, maybe the first place to start.
Mhm.
There is a there's this general assumption that has emerged in the last few years as um Americans have become more aware of Canadian politics in the last 6 or 7 years. It's actually a little bit strange to me. But
Sure.
they have definitely become a little bit more aware of Canadian politics. And one thing that I think most Americans who do know maybe something about Canadian politics
Mhm.
understand is that Alberta might be the most conservative part of Canada.
Okay.
However, I really want to make sure that, if Americans hopefully understand this.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean what you think it means.
Sure.
Canadian politics does not function on the same axis as American politics.
Okay.
So you can be a very, very blue Canadian conservative, like, in Canada, the colors are flipped. The conservatives are blue and the liberals are red.
Mhm.
You can be a true blue conservative from Alberta in Canada, and your politics might look very different from a Republican in the United States.
Okay.
So the issues are a little bit different. The
Mhm.
culture is a little bit different. And the primary divisions in Canada do not neatly map onto an American political map.
Okay.
So Alberta is probably the most conservative Canadian province. But when I say conservative, what I really mean is it's the home of the Conservative Party of Canada.
Okay. Sure.
You would, for instance, be hard pressed to find too many Albertans that don't want universal health care.
Wow. Okay.
You would be hard pressed to find many Albertans who are now you might find a few more Albertans who are willing to experiment in healthcare than you'll find in other provinces.
Sure.
Okay. But like universal healthcare is slightly less of a sacred cow in Alberta as it is in the rest of the country, but it's still a sacred cow.
Sure. Okay.
Um, while you'll find gun owners in Alberta and people who
Mhm.
want more gun rights, it's not, they aren't seeking the same sort of gun rights you see in the United States,
Sure.
right? And their
Mhm.
perspective on what it would mean to have gun rights might look a lot closer to the left of the Democratic Party on gun
Okay.
rights
Yeah.
than it would look in the Republican Party. So,
Mhm.
Alberta, when I say it's conservative, what I really
Mhm.
mean is there's maybe three issues that make it specifically very conservative.
Sure.
One is that its primary industry is oil and gas
Okay.
extraction, and it's desperate to export that oil and gas somewhere.
Sure.
We have There's two primary oil industries in Alberta. We have bitumen, so heavy oil, which is in the oil sands in northern Alberta. It has been sometimes referred to as the tar sands by its opponents. It is a little more emissions intensive. It also
Mhm.
requires an additional step. It has to be upgraded before it can be refined.
True.
Um, and however, much of the traditional Alberta oil field is conventional oil. It's not bitumen, but most of the
Sure.
reserves are bitumen reserves.
Mhm.
And so what that means is Alberta's economy depends on being able to produce or to extract and sell oil. Sorry, for those of you who now see me in a very different room, that's because I moved because apparently my Wi-Fi didn't like the room I was sitting in. So, if you see a cat come by, I'm sorry, I'm recording at home, and I'm now doing it from my kitchen.
Wi-Fi can be pretty temperamental and discerning like that. So going back to our previous conversation, you were discussing the oil and gas industry in Alberta, um, specifically bitumen.
And so there's two major sectors of oil and gas extraction. Oil extraction, I should say. Natural gas extraction is different. Oil extraction. Bitumen and conventional.
Sure.
The bitumen is the mostly through the Athabasca oil
Mhm.
sands. The opponents of heavy oil sand production often call it tar sands. And that's up in the Athabasca oil sands, primarily centered around the city of Fort McMurray in Alberta. Yeah, but that's still the primary center of oil sand production. But oil sand production um, has, all right, I'm not going to say that, okay, because I don't have the statistics at my fingertips. But there has not been the same sort of optimism
Sure.
around oil sand production since 2014 in Alberta. And but the conventional oil has generally done okay, even though we sell it at a steep discount to primarily to the United States. Um, the the Canadian oil and the Alberta oil industry, although it goes back to the early 20th century, the modern incarnation of it goes to the 1970s to the publicly subsidized by the province of Alberta creation of the infrastructure around
That
Fort
understood
McMurray
your
and the
disposal.
Alberta oil sands. Okay, so the fact that is the primary oil producer in Canada leads to a big crisis in confederation between Eastern Canada, which is a consumer of oil, and Western Canada, which is a producer of oil, and Alberta, which is a producer of oil.
Mhm.
Um, in the 1980s, the Liberal government of Pierre Trudeau, the father of Justin Trudeau, put
Mhm.
together something called the National Energy Policy. And the
Sure.
National Energy Policy essentially, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but it gave the federal government a tremendous degree of control over
Sure.
Alberta oils. And it basically forced price conditions to benefit Eastern consumers at the expense of Alberta producers.
Sure.
And this is to some degree the the true Western alienation goes back further than that. Alberta alienation
Mhm.
goes back further than that. But in its modern form, it goes back to the 1980s, where Albertans believe their economy was shattered for the benefit of Eastern Canada. And this goes back to Confederation, that there's some grievances about that, but in its modern form, it goes back to the National Energy Program of the early
Sure.
1980s, led by Pierre Trudeau. And
Mhm.
since then, basically, with a few exceptions here and there and a few seats, the Liberal Party ceases to exist in Alberta
Sure.
ever since then.
Mhm.
Um, Again, the occasionally a Liberal wins. There's two current MPs from Alberta that there's, but they win in very urban, leafy ridings where they're
Mhm.
more distant from the oil,
Yeah.
and they usually win. They win very narrowly.
Sure.
They do, and it's, some you get a one-term MP from Alberta occasionally.
Sure. Mhm.
Very, really since Anne McClellan, who was Jean Chrétien's deputy PM, she had Edmonton Center again, which was the government district of Edmonton. She controlled Edmonton Center for a while, but she won narrowly. They nicknamed her nickname was Landslide Annie because she used to win by a couple of hundred votes each time, but she did keep managing to win for a
Yeah,
while. But she's the last liberal to really hold a seat for a long period of time in Alberta.
sure. That's funny. In South Dakota, there Tom Daschle was a senator from South Dakota, and he had the same nickname, Landslide Tom, because he won his first race, I think, for Congress by about 2 dozen votes, and then he won his first race for Senate by, I think, a few hundred votes, and so it's funny that that nickname, translates on both sides of the border.
And so when Chrétien was prime minister, which was the 1990s, he was a liberal prime minister. Although
Mhm.
he didn't directly affect the oil industry with any of his, or didn't directly target the oil industry, it
Sure.
suited him for his politics to dismiss Alberta, make fun of Alberta,
Mhm.
consider them a bunch of hicks, basically, compared to the central Canada.
Mhm.
He wasn't winning any seats out there, so he didn't really need to worry about it. What he really needed to do was to win seats in Ontario and Quebec, and
Mhm.
winning seats in Ontario and Quebec, making fun of Alberta helps you do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So that alienated the West more from the Liberal Party.
Mhm.
When Stephen Harper became prime minister in 2006, he was an Ontarian by birth, but became an Albertan and is considered an Albertan. The
Mhm.
10 years under Harper, the West felt like they were governing the whole country for the first time, maybe ever.
Mhm.
And then when Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015, he very purposely um, built a coalition that isolated Alberta,
Sure.
and so for the last 10 years, this just makes Albertans think, okay, it's the same old liberals.
Mhm.
They just hate Alberta and they have no time for Alberta. And
Mhm.
and part of that coalition meant for Justin Trudeau building a very environmentally friendly
Mhm.
coalition, which marginalized oil production in Alberta. There were several acts of parliament that were passed. If Alberta ever does separate, these will be kind of like the intolerable acts
Sure.
of the American Revolution, sort of connected to that notion.
Mhm.
One of them is a tanker ban. You can't have oil tankers up a considerable portion of the BC coast, so that
Mhm.
prevents Alberta from being able to export its oil across the Pacific
Mhm.
from many locations. Um, they prevented further pipelines from being built. Only one pipeline was really built, and it was an expansion to the
Mhm.
west coast. And basically, the Liberal government had made such a mess of the file that in order to get it built, the Liberal government actually had to buy it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The private developer left it, got rid of it.
Mhm.
Um, and so there's a long history there. And so that what that has done is that has connected Alberta to be the main opposition in Confederation to central Canada, which is an area that is which is the liberal stronghold. So that
Absolutely.
has made Alberta the Conservative Party's stronghold. Whether or not that actually makes Alberta conservative or not, um, in an American's mind,
Yeah.
it is the home of conservatism in Canada because it's the home of the opposition to central Canadian visions of Confederation.
Mhm. That's really fascinating. I think when many Americans think about Canadian politics, when or if they do, the main division that they think of is between Quebec and the rest of Canada on that language barrier and along that cultural barrier. And so, viewing Canada through this more economic lens and the divisions between Alberta and the rest of Canada offers a whole new perspective to a lot of Americans who have never considered those economic divisions within Canada before. So now
Yeah,
going
and I'm just gonna sorry, Jack, I'm just gonna
go
jump
right
in
ahead.
there for a second if that's okay. I
Mhm.
It's not just Alberta. Alberta's just the home of it.
Sure.
Saskatchewan and Manitoba feel very and parts of BC feel very much the
Mhm.
same way.
No.
And
I
again,
appreciate that. Yeah.
yeah,
That's a
these
good
are
point.
natural resource producing
Mhm.
places. That is the primary industry. It's either agriculture or minerals.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
In central Canada, particularly around the Great Lakes, the main industry historically is manufacturing.
Mhm.
So it's secondary industry.
Yeah.
And if you're, and so going back, well, back into the 20th century, if you're a manufacturer, it behooves you to get minerals and natural resources as cheaply as possible
There you go.
and to sell your goods within Canada and to protect the Canadian, there was a century of protectionism in Canada
Mhm.
where they wanted to sell their goods as expensively as possible, right? And
Mhm.
so and so that creates this economic battle between
Yes.
the natural resource producing West and the industrial central Canada.
Mhm. That's fascinating. And it's intriguing that you can see these historical parallels between the United States and Canada. You think of the battle between manufacturing and agriculture, or resource production, and then you think about an American figure like William Jennings Bryan. And so in many ways, like looking at Canadian politics and Canadian history is almost like looking at a funhouse mirror of American politics and American history, where it's, there are similarities, but the differences just make it all that more fascinating.
Yeah, there are differences, but I'm a historian of the period between between the U.S. Civil War and the Second World War, and one of
Mhm.
the reasons I feel really comfortable in that period of politics is it actually resembles Canadian contemporary politics to some degree.
Sure.
I don't want
Mhm.
to overstate the similarities,
Oh,
but
absolutely.
there's some very structural similarities there.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing back up those current issues, because we're here to talk today not only about, historical crises and historical conflicts, but also, as you mentioned in the beginning, the crises in Canada at the present moment. So, Rob, what the heck is going on in Alberta?
Well,
What has been making these headlines?
so there's two major constitutional crises in Canada. Both have to do with separation. One,
Mhm.
Quebec separatism is back,
Mhm.
and Alberta separatism.
Yeah.
There is um, Justin Trudeau, frankly, created the conditions in Alberta for a considerable amount of grievances. People can disagree over their legitimacy or not, but there's certainly the perception of enormous grievances towards central Canada and towards the Liberal Party, and then towards just the notion of Canada.
Yeah.
Alberta separatism has existed for a long time, but it's been a very fringe issue.
Mhm.
Very fringe. But under Justin Trudeau, that accelerated. And so again, the primary reason for that is economic, and it has to do with oil and gas. Canadian productivity declined substantially in the years that Justin Trudeau was prime minister, and one of the key reasons for that was because he really put up obstacles to energy development, particularly oil development,
Mhm.
and made it difficult to export and made it difficult to export it profitably is probably a better way of putting it. And so the Alberta economy has never, even though it's still the strongest provincial economy in Canada,
Mhm.
Albertans feel poor
Yeah.
compared to how they felt in 2011, 12, and 13 during the last major boom.
Sure.
Um, and so many Albertans who work in the oil industry, and it's a really acute issue in the oil industry, but
Mhm.
they've looked at, the Alberta oil industry is not limited to Alberta. They've got customers in the United States. They've got
Oh, absolutely.
companies that are on both sides of the border. And
Mhm.
they look at their colleagues in places like North Dakota and in places like Montana and in then
Mhm.
places like Texas and Oklahoma. And they see, why are these guys doing so well? Why are they making money hand over fist and we can't?
Mhm. I'm happy you brought that up. I was gonna mention the, potential similarities and yet the sort of created differences between Albertan oil fields and the Bakken fields in North Dakota. It I that is a fascinating comparison to make, and one that on another podcast episode we should go into more thoroughly. But anyway, continue.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting connections there. And a
Mhm.
lot of the same people worked on them.
Yes.
They're not
Mhm.
different people. A lot of the contractors, a lot of the
Mhm.
laborers were people who worked in Alberta or worked in North Dakota.
Yeah, I mean, they're so close geographically, it's one thing for an Albertan to say, "Well, a Texan, leads a different life than me or has a different income than I do." But North Dakotans, it's like they're rubbing it in your face right up against your front door. It's
Yeah,
a completely different emotional response.
exactly. And I definitely think I don't know, I don't have anything to base this on. It's entirely anecdotal, but the
Mhm.
fact that North Dakota and Montana were doing so well
Yeah.
really irritated Albertans.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people get really irritated when North Dakotans do well, me included.
Sure. But anyway, so um what's happened is that and I don't want to get into the very nitty-gritty details here, but there have been
Mhm.
several events that have led to a very organized separatist movement in Alberta.
Yes. Mhm.
Um, you know what? There's some cultural issues too. I'm gonna circle back to those, but let's just get out. Like I'm on a train of thought here. I don't want to get distracted.
Mhm.
Um, the There's called the Alberta Prosperity Project. It's led by a guy named Jeffrey Rath.
Mhm.
In its current incarnation, and they are currently in the process of trying to collect 178,000 signatures in 4 months. And if they accomplish that, then they will be able to get a referendum on whether Alberta should leave the country or not.
Sure.
And the conventional wisdom is they won't make 178,000, but I'm not sure about that at all.
Okay. I if I could jump in here just for a moment. In America, there's a lot of almost joking talk about American separatist movements. There's all the jokes about Texas separatism, for example, and creating that Lone Star state. I was wondering if you could talk about the seriousness of the separatist or Albertan independence movements. It's sort of in comparison to that less serious perception we have of such movements in the United States.
It's very serious. I
Mhm.
mean, they're Albertans are very serious about this. The
Yep.
Albertans who are into it are very serious about this.
Mhm.
Again, there's a long history of Alberta separatism.
Mhm.
I, you know, it has been a fringe movement, but there's a large degree of it. And remember, I opened by saying there's this identity. People identify far more with Alberta than they do with Canada. You
Mhm.
don't see that in Texas.
No. Mm-mm.
People are very proud of being American.
Mhm.
You
Absolutely.
do not have that same pride in Canada and Alberta.
Mhm. I think that's really fascinating. That sort of identifying with your own state in the United States, as opposed with the United States of America, really diminished after the Civil War. You hear stories before the Civil War, Robert E. Lee, for example, saying, I'm a Virginian and then I'm for the United States. And so hearing that continuing on in Canada and being such a motivating force even today is, from an American point of view, very fascinating.
Yeah, that statement, that Lee's famous statement,
Hmm.
um, you'd be hard pressed to find many people who feel like that today outside of maybe a couple of states, and it wouldn't be very big.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe, there might be people on the left who are kind of eager for their state to separate, but I don't necessarily know that they've got like huge pride in the state of Oregon.
Hmm.
I think they're just attached to some fundamental ideological values.
Hmm. Yeah.
Whereas in Alberta, it is a geographic, provincial, political community identity.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing that up. Um, as we're talking about the sort of our American listenership and viewership in our American office or audience, pardon me, it's essential, I think, to really narrow in on these discrepancies and ensure that we understand, Canadian politics, while it might be like ours, while it might have some similarities, is fundamentally this different thing. So we've talked now about the economic element of Albertan separatism and how that is manifesting itself in the current political conditions in Alberta. I want to turn now to the social issues that you alluded to. In Alberta, there's recently been a spat or a controversy about a bill banning trans girls from entering into sports. Um, which is not by any means the only example of that sort of social division between Alberta and the rest of Canada. I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit.
And I don't. It's also not the rest of Canada. There are many provinces that have similar bills on the books.
Sure.
And even and I'm not sure what the situation is in Ontario.
Mhm.
Um, but that wouldn't actually be something necessarily, that would be a pretty conventional viewpoint across much of Canada,
Okay, sure.
frankly.
Mhm,
Um, the there was controversy, as there would be in an American state,
mhm,
over it. The primary there's a couple of cultural issues that
mhm,
that have driven this forward,
mhm,
particularly in rural areas of Alberta, where, much like rural areas of South Dakota, there's lots of distance between populations.
mhm,
The COVID
absolutely,
lockdowns,
sure.
the national COVID lockdowns have a lot of resonance in this, and
Mhm,
particularly the trucker convoy made a
yes.
lot of international news. There was a lot of Albertans involved in that.
Mhm,
And Albertans felt like they were uniquely targeted when they were called terrorists, when they were called these various things by the national government. And there was virtually no violence associated with
sure.
that.
Mhm,
At least the main movement that went to Ottawa, yes, it occupied a great deal of space, but
yeah.
there were some rumors of violence, but most of those rumors proved to be inaccurate.
Mhm,
Um, and so the fact that some Albertans were targeted, they were locked out of their bank accounts because, like, they gave $50 to the trucker convoy. You hear a
sure.
lot of complaints about that. I still don't know how widespread that actually was, but it was a threat that was certainly levied by the federal government. And again,
Mhm,
whether it was actually done or not doesn't matter. By issuing the threat, people felt like it had happened.
yes, absolutely. Mhm,
And so the much longer COVID lockdowns in Canada,
mhm,
there was an outdoor church outside of Spruce Grove, Alberta, which is just west of Edmonton,
mhm,
that sprung up in COVID. And
yeah.
the services were happening outdoors, and the RCMP would block people from being able to access it.
Mhm,
So there were issues. RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the federal
yeah.
police. So there were issues like that. And again, it doesn't necessarily matter how long the RCMP were out there for, how many
Mhm,
Sundays.
yeah.
The fact they were out there one Sunday was too many,
Mhm,
frankly,
absolutely.
in people's minds, at least, right?
Imagine a
And
reaction in I can't imagine the reaction in South Dakota, for example, if you had, National Guard troops or something blocking the entrance to a church service. On that note, would you say that the, um, severity or the more rigorous COVID, lockdowns imposed by the Canadian government, as opposed to the absence of such sort of nationalized policies across the United States, where it was really a state by state thing. Do you think that that caused the response to COVID and the sort of emotional power that COVID still holds to be higher in Canada than in the United States?
so, the provinces largely lacked the COVID
Mhm.
response. It was a
Sure.
province by province issue, just like in the United States, where it was a
Okay.
state by state issue. But the federal government utilized where they did have authority and very aggressively pushed for more lockdown
Mhm.
style politics.
Sure.
And the reason they did that very purposely, it was a political winner in
Yeah.
central Canada and in Quebec.
Mhm.
And it was a political winner there, and in certain urban areas,
Mhm.
right?
No, I appreciate, and that's a better phrasing, than what I used. Amongst, like, the average Canadian, or pardon me, the average Albertan voter, um, if you compare that to, say, the average Arizona voter, would you consider the Albertan voter to be more motivated by COVID and the remembrance of the COVID lockdowns than, say, your average Arizona voter?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and that I think that, again, with our American audience, remembering, that sort of sharp pang of COVID and how that it motivates other people in other nations, um, even more than it motivates us. That's really fascinating. So, we talked about COVID as a cultural motivating issue. Are there sort of other cultural motivating issues at play in Alberta?
I mean, Albertans are a very entrepreneurial, dynamic, uh, group of people. These
Mhm.
are, the descendants of homesteaders.
Yes.
They are, there's a lot of small business in Alberta, an unbelievable amount of small business in Alberta. And so there is this dynamism that's associated with that. that's also very that leads itself to be more individualistic. So there
Sure.
is sort of more of an individualism than a collectivism in Alberta. And historically, actually, you could look at Saskatchewan as sort of being the more rural collectivist tradition versus Alberta as the rural individualist tradition. And they kind of,
Right.
you could look at them almost, there was almost perfect sample size of each.
Well,
However, that has changed. Saskatchewan has largely abandoned that rural collectivist tradition. There's
mm,
still some of it in there, but it's largely gone.
sure.
Um, just as politics has changed.
Absolutely.
Um, so that's one big issue. And so while central Canada is the unions are more of an play more of an important role in central Canadian politics, um, more established business exists in central Canadian politics in places like Ontario. Ontario is still a very dynamic entrepreneurial place. I don't want to I don't want to make that comparison. It's very dynamic.
Mm,
But um, Ontarians are a little more eager for regulation
sure.
than Albertans are, just
Mhm.
generally.
Yeah.
The Albertans are probably per capita slightly more religious
Okay.
than Ontario
Mhm.
and the east coast of Canada.
Sure.
And if they're slightly more, and I'm just slightly,
Mhm.
this is not like going to an American town where there's 35 churches.
Sure.
Okay. I just hosted an Albertan conservative down here for a few days, and he was telling me, he's like, I can't get over how much God there is here,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
In the Phoenix area. And I'm
Yeah.
sure there's a lot of Christians in the Phoenix area who are appalled by the lack of God
Mhm.
that's present in
Oh,
the Phoenix area, right?
absolutely.
So there while there is probably slightly larger Christian religiosity, Protestant Christian religiosity in Alberta, and
Mhm.
that Protestant Christian religiosity might be a little more um, conservative than
Sure.
what exists in the rest of the country.
Mhm.
It maybe it might be more it might be enough to make it unmarginal,
Mhm.
but it's not a significant motivating force outside of those communities where it is.
No, absolutely.
But on the aggregate, it's not.
Mhm. No,
It's
absolutely.
primarily economic
Mhm.
and the belief that Alberta has been gotten the raw deal of confederation since 1867. That Alberta, well, when Alberta was brought in 1905, that when Alberta was brought into confederation in 1905, it has been
Mhm.
brought in to be exploited by central Canada.
That is really fascinating. It in the United States, again, in the beginning of the United States, the notion of a collection or a confederation of states was very prominent, and then that sort of subsided over time. And so it's fascinating to look at Canada where that attitude is still so strong. And
Yeah.
yeah, and see almost an alternative view of the United States that we could have held if, various historical events had gone differently. So,
Sure.
yeah.
And I mean, I think in the United States, one of the things that killed states' rights, if you want
Mhm.
to call it that, is the fact that it was most frequently leveraged
Mhm.
for racist reasons,
Yeah. Mhm.
right? And so, what might have actually been a perfectly legitimate approach to take
Mhm.
to having a polity um, was kind of poisoned by the use that it was put to.
Sure, John Calhoun sort of ruined that argument. Yeah.
Sure. Um, but in Canada, it's never really been used for that. Although we can talk about Quebec for a moment,
Mhm.
and I
Oh,
think that
absolutely.
you might see
Let's talk
something
about Quebec
interesting
for a moment.
there.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm just gonna I'll finish up Alberta, and then I want to move to Quebec.
Sure.
Um, Alberta, again, it's about 30% of the population, depending on the poll that you read, that supports separation.
Sure.
Um, I think more than that want a referendum,
Okay. Yeah.
and I this has been boiling in some form or another for 45 years.
Sure.
And I
Given
think there's a lot of Albertans who just need to get this fight needs to happen. This political fight needs to happen now. And we're going to talk about Quebec in a second. Um, whether it will be successful, I'm skeptical that it would be successful.
Sure. And
But
that's one thing that I wanted to ask you. is, do you think that there's a sizable population of Albertans who want to have a referendum, will sign the petition because they want to vote no, because they want the question to be sort of settled in that way?
I
Um,
don't know that there are going to be people who are eager to sign the petition and really eager for it. I think what you'll
Mhm.
find is there's a lot of people who are eager for it because they want to think about it, because they want it presented to them
They
and
want
they
the
want to make a decision.
Okay, that's
Um,
really fascinating. Yeah. In that, it's a lot like, in Scottish independence, if you're sort of casting around for a comparison. I know that was a movement or a sentiment that was high where folks who didn't necessarily want to be independent, still wanted the referendum, still wanted the debate. So now moving over to Quebec, would you say, well, let's actually start here. If Alberta's concerns or grievances with the Canadian Confederation are primarily economic, it would be accurate to say that Quebec's are primarily social. Would that be a
Cultural, yes,
assessment or
cultural or
cultural?
social,
Yeah.
yes.
So could you go into some of those? And I know Americans are probably more familiar with this divide, but could you go into that divide
Sure.
between
Um,
Quebec and the rest of the Confederation?
yeah. So, I mean, Quebec it prides itself as being a unilingual French province.
Mhm.
It's not a unilingual French province. There's a lot of English spoken there,
Mhm.
but it is officially a unilingual French province. And
Sure.
the the Quebec government, going back
Mhm.
to Confederation and earlier into the colonial period, Confederation was 1867, going back into the
Mm,
colonial period, the Quebec government has viewed its role to be the protection of the French language and French culture.
sure.
Um, in the when French Canada or New France was conquered by Britain in 1759
Mhm.
and became integrated into the British Empire.
Yeah.
Um, you have this population of people who are not English, do not want to be English, and are conquered.
Mhm.
And there's been this question as to what to do with them
Mhm.
ever since. And they have, frankly, quite impressively, I mean this very impressively,
Mm.
managed to maintain their culture and language for 250 years,
Yeah.
which is impressive.
Mhm.
And their biggest fear is becoming Louisiana.
Sure.
When they look at Louisiana, which was another part of the French Empire, but it basically assimilated into the United States. Yes, there's some French culture there.
Mm.
Yes,
Yeah.
but they are desperate to not let that happen.
Mhm. Because in Louisiana, it's more of a novelty, it's like a tourist attraction. It's
Right.
not it's yeah, played up. Mhm.
Right. Where and in parts of the Maritimes in Canada, it's also a bit of a tourist attraction, where there
Mhm.
was French settlement and then it was conquered by the British. That's where the Acadian expulsion happened, where
Mhm.
Acadians were many of the French settlers there were expelled. There was a
Mhm.
genocide against them, frankly, by the British government, and they ended up many of them ended up in Louisiana. This is where Cajun comes from. It's Acadian,
Sure.
right? Cajun.
Mhm.
Um, But Quebec looks at themselves and has historically looked at itself as do not want to become Louisiana.
Mhm.
And so they have tried to put as many like legal and political obstacles to prevent that from happening.
Sure.
And so their whole bargain with Canada has generally been, we'll go along with it, but if we think that our culture is under assault, we will leave.
Sure. Mhm.
And so in Quebec, separatism really became a big force in the 1970s. There was the
Sure.
FLQ, which was a radical left wing separatist group that was responsible for mailbox bombings. And
Mhm.
in fact, they even kidnapped the federal transport minister and killed him.
Oh, wow. Mhm. Wow.
Um, the Weathermen, actually, things that Americans might be more familiar with, they got a lot of their weapons from the FLQ.
Sure.
And so there was a lot of connections actually between the Weathermen, around Brooklyn particularly,
Mhm.
and the FLQ leadership. In fact, Canada declared martial law when
Wow.
the transport minister was kidnapped.
Mhm.
Um, and it's one of only two political assassinations in Canada
Wow.
when he was murdered.
Mhm.
Um, the so that kind of brought it to the forefront, but there was always a much more mainstream, like non-violent, non-radical form of Quebec separatism, which is more conservative for sure.
Sure.
Left economically left wing, but very conservative culturally.
Sure.
Um,
Absolutely.
they've in Quebec provincial politics historically, this is formed around a group called the Parti Québécois, the PQ,
Mhm.
and they're a major political party in Quebec.
Sure.
Since the 1970s, really one of the two main political parties. There's another party that's been in power the last several years, but
Mhm.
one of the two main political parties. And the main political issue in Quebec has been, are we do we want more integration with Canada or less integration with Canada? And the Parti Québécois, the first two times they won majority governments held referendums in 1980 and then 1995. The last time they held government, I'd have to check. I actually think it was a minority government, so they didn't have the ability to pass the bill through the legislature. But they appear on the edge of winning a very large majority government in the election, which will be in the fall. And so they haven't promised so severely that they can't walk it back to hold a referendum, but they've made it pretty clear they want Pierre Plamondon, who's the leader, has made it very clear that he wants to hold a referendum.
And if such a referendum was held, say today, would it pass, in your opinion?
Today it might pass. 2 weeks
Mhm.
ago, I'm not sure it would, but today it would.
Sure.
And in 2 weeks from now, I'm not sure. So what happened about last week? Mark Carney, the prime minister,
Mhm.
after having frankly a tour de force in Davos,
Mhm.
um, the following week he was in Quebec for a big liberal meeting in Quebec City, and he did a big address on the Plains of Abraham, which was where in 1759 the English forces under General Wolfe um, defeated the final French force.
Mhm.
It wasn't the final force, but it was a climactic battle, the decisive
Sure.
battle to control Quebec, to
Mhm.
control French Canada, and led to the extinguishment of French claims in Canada.
Sure.
And he said, we go back to 1759 as, building this Canadian project together,
Mhm.
right? Well, you want to bring a really stinky fish on the table and put it on the table in Quebec.
Mhm.
It's by ignoring the fact that from the Quebec perspective, the Plains of Abraham was the beginnings of their colonization
Sure. Yeah.
and their subjugation
Sure.
within Canada. Whereas Carney tried to present it as, here is the beginning of our partnership. The Quebecers are
Mhm.
like, partnership,
Yeah.
right? What are you talking about?
Yeah, in an incredibly insensitive remark. Yeah.
This is what happens when you have a guy who hasn't spent much time in Canada in a very long time and doesn't really
Mhm.
understand kind of the weird neuroses of the various provinces. And
Sure.
this is
Yeah.
neuroses, to be
Uh-huh.
clear, to
Mhm.
some degree, I mean, there's some degree, but they're very sensitive about this.
Yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
um it totally recoverable from that. Don't get me wrong. This is
Yeah.
a blip.
Mhm.
But if he had done this 2 weeks before, or like 5 days before there was a vote on
Yes.
a like it would have been devastating. But there's not going to be a
Mhm.
vote in 5 days, so it doesn't really
Sure.
matter.
Yeah.
Um, if if a referendum were held in Quebec, I tend to think it would be closer to a yes than it would be in
Sure.
Alberta.
Mhm. And so with that, say the vote is held tomorrow, hypothetically, and Quebec votes yes, we want out. What would that process look like? Do we even know what
Well,
a
so okay, so that's a great question. On the
Mhm.
one hand, that's the $1 million question
Sure.
for both provinces.
Mhm.
What does it look like? And both yes sides historically in the Quebec context, which is where we have the most experience with this,
Mhm.
have been very vague
Sure.
on what that actually means. And
Mhm.
usually the referendum question is something along the lines of, do you give us authority to begin negotiating our exit from Canada?
Okay, sure.
It's not a we are independent tomorrow, it's beginning the negotiation
Sure.
for it. Um, I think people have dreams of what that will look like, and I think people
Sure.
have nightmares of what that will look like.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, there is an act, the Clarity Act, passed in 1996 by the Liberal government
Mhm.
in the wake of the 1995 referendum, that did put some rules around what it would look like. So, in
Okay.
fact, what's interesting about Canada is we might be one of the few countries in the world that actually has national law that addresses this question.
Okay, yeah. So what are those laws?
Well, one of the most important aspect of the law, and the one that is probably the most salient first,
Mhm.
is what a question must actually look like.
Okay.
So and this is why it's called the Clarity Act, because the
Mhm.
key aspect of this is that for the federal government to recognize such a referendum, the
Mhm.
question has to be clear.
Sure.
In 1980, and I think and in 1995 in Quebec, the
Mhm.
question was very confusing.
Okay.
And there was a Canadian political comedy show decades ago, and
Mhm.
it was during the referendum of 1995. They did a skit where the separatist leaders were trying to focus group what the right question is that they should ask,
Yeah.
and they went through like several people, and
Mhm.
the last question they asked was one that the person was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about," and they're like, "Yes, that's the one we're going to go with. Perfect."
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, that's exaggerating the point, but
Mhm.
so they want to be the law. There's expectations as to how clear the question must be.
Sure.
And both and the Alberta, we think we have what the question is going to be in
Okay.
Alberta, and
Mhm.
it more than meets those.
Sure.
It's not a confusing question. It's pretty
Mhm.
black and white. We don't know what the Quebec one would be yet.
Sure. Yeah. It's fascinating to have a confederation enact laws about how that confederation would dissolve or
Now,
the process by which.
importantly, the Clarity Act does not say how many yes votes are enough.
Okay. That was gonna be my next question is could it be a simple majority or would you have to get, 3/4
The
or.
yes forces in each province will say absolutely.
Mhm.
All we need is 50% plus one.
Wow. And
But will the federal government acknowledge that?
yeah. And so then you get into a question of if such a referendum was held and you get, I don't know, 52% saying yes, and then you would bring a lawsuit, would the separatist forces even recognize that lawsuit? Because they could just say, look, we've separated. We just voted to separate. And what is this foreign court? What authority do they have over us? What an incredibly thorny legal question.
And
Yeah. Uh,
there lies the interesting geopolitical
mhm.
implications.
Yeah.
Um, there is no doubt, I mean, we're on the south side of the border, that there are people on this side of the border that would seek to intervene in such a situation.
Mhm. If and that was going to be my next question, and, sort of wrapping it up with the question of the United States for our US listeners. In the hypothetical situation in which Quebec or Alberta, less possibly, were to separate, what would the probable United States response to that be? Would the United States be all on board with that? Would they side with a Canadian government who's trying to, answer such legal questions? How would the US respond?
I don't necessarily want to speculate.
Sure.
I think Americans, if there's anybody who has any influence who listens to this,
Mhm.
my best advice is to stay out of it until
Sure.
at least a certain point, certainly until the referendum's held and
Mhm.
finished. At that point, it might behoove you to say, self-determination, guys. They don't want to be
Mhm.
in. We recognize this new state. Whether then they choose to say, hey, we would like to integrate that new state into the United States is a completely different question.
Mhm.
And as a Canadian, there's dragons there.
Mhm.
A lot of dragons there. We are nowhere near that, frankly,
Yeah.
from so as we get closer, maybe I'll have more to say, if this eventuality comes to pass, might
Mhm.
have more to say on that. But it would be messy, and it would be
Mhm.
up to individuals in the US government really what they want to do.
Sure.
Um, the only advice I would offer Americans is to probably um if a separated province
Mhm.
comes to the United States and says we would like to join you,
Mhm.
then maybe there's then that may be yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
But I would advise Americans to not get involved until something like that were to happen,
Sure.
until a recognized authority in that province or now
Mm.
independent state
Yeah.
approached Washington
Yeah.
with such a proposal.
Mhm.
If they were to get involved before then, it would be
Yeah.
it would be it would be difficult to say they'll
Mhm.
not I
Yeah.
could imagine various ways that it could go.
And that's really intriguing advice given the historical penchant for Washington to get involved. Historically, the United States government hasn't been very good at not involving itself in things. And so we will see. Certainly, we will have an emergency podcast if either Alberta or Quebec were to vote to separate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's just one other thing I should probably bring up. Sorry,
Yes.
Jack, you're into this thing, but um,
No, of course.
there are rumors right now that Mark Carney is considering another snap election
Okay.
in the spring, and
Sure.
so this weekend actually, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk is this weekend the Canadian Conservatives are meeting in Calgary,
Mhm.
and according to the party constitution, if your leader loses an election at the next party convention, they have to have a leadership review.
Okay.
And so in order to win that, in order to maintain leader, they have to win 50% plus one of the vote.
Sure.
And so Pierre Poilievre, the Canadian Conservative leader, tomorrow is going to face such a vote
Mhm.
in Calgary. He will likely clear 50%. I'm not worried about that.
Sure.
But there is precedent in Canadian history for if somebody only gets 65% of the vote
Mhm.
or doesn't get like a resounding at least 80% of the vote
Sure.
for them to resign.
Yes. Mhm.
And so that's always possible. And at the same time, the Ontario Conservative Party
Mhm.
is holding their convention in Ontario this weekend.
Okay.
And what the thing that shows is that the Ontario Conservative Party is very upset with the National Conservative Party.
Sure.
And so there's this big division within the Conservative Party between Ontario and the National Party. And the National Party tends to be dominated by Alberta and by the
Mhm.
West. And so there's this interesting division, intra-party division
Mhm.
in the Conservative Party right now between Doug Ford, who's the Premier of Ontario, and the Ontario Conservatives versus the National Conservatives
Sure.
at a time when Mark Carney's riding high in the polls, that despite his performance at the Plains of Abraham,
Mhm.
but because of his Davos speech, and
Mhm.
before the he actually has to produce anything
Yes.
based
Mhm.
on that. I think he wants a majority government. He's very close to having a majority in parliament as it is. But
Sure.
I think he wants a big majority. He probably looks at this as being his best moment for 5 years.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so the Canadian US trade deal is up for negotiation in the summer and into the fall
Mhm.
with Mexico, the US MCA. So um, it wouldn't surprise me if he wants a really strong majority government to go into that.
Mhm.
And the conservatives are definitely having a fight
Mhm.
while Alberta's having a fight between the separatists and the conservatives who don't want to separate
Mhm.
in Alberta.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's lots of different axes spinning everywhere in
Yes.
Canadian politics right now. And most of them probably benefit Carney politically,
Mhm.
in the short term, which again is probably why he wants to hold an election.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
in Canada, you get to pick when you hold an election if you're the government, basically. There's some constraints, but you can basically pick when you want to have an
Mhm.
election.
Yeah. I mean, if I was Mark Carney, like, I would absolutely be in favor of holding the election.
Yes, and the only danger is there is a history of um there's a history of people holding snap elections when they're riding high in the polls
Mm,
and losing
sure.
because Canadians get angry or the electorate gets angry and they see the cynicism of it and they go,
Sure.
"We didn't need an election.
Mm,
Why did you threaten us? And we're going to
sure.
punish you for it."
Okay. All right.
So it's campaigns in Canada are usually 35 days to 40 days.
Mhm.
And more so in the United States because they're this really short, truncated period,
Yeah.
weird things happen.
Sure.
Anyway,
Yeah. No, it's fascinating, and should he call the election, we will certainly, have to have another podcast where we talk about it and dissect it. Look forward to the number 1 Canadian political podcast episode hitting your feeds, and, with that, Rob, unfortunately, I've gotta go, but it's been great talking with you, and thank you for giving me the reins for the podcast for a day. I hope that I, continued our standard of excellence, going forward.
definitely did. Thanks.
Alright. Alright, thank you.